We'll get started because we're a bit pushed for time. I'm Stuart Davis. I'm a partner in the London office at Latham and Watkins, and I'm one of the co-chairs of our digital assets group. I'm here with a fantastic panel. We're here to talk about the wonders and niggles of the EU and UK. I think if the last session was focusing on some of the uncertainties surrounding things like staking and just the general regulatory environment, this session is focusing on what happens when legislators and regulators seek to get their act together and actually produce regimes, but also what are some of the sort of maybe negative consequences of that. So I'm here with Tommaso Astasi from Blockchain for Europe, Marina Markezic, did I pronounce that correctly? Fantastic. From the European Crypto Initiative, and Teana Baker-Taylor from Circle. I'll ask each of the panelists just to do a quick intro on themselves. Why don't we start with you, Teana?
So I'm Teana Baker-Taylor, and I am the Vice President of Policy and Strategy for EMEA at Circle. I've been in the policy space and the crypto space for about 7 years. So have gone through this process in both Europe and the UK pretty intimately with Tommaso, the rest of the battle up here. So.
My name is Marina. I'm the director and co-founder of the European Crypto Initiative, which is a non-profit advocacy organization based in Brussels. We do talk to European regulators of all the matters linked to crypto. And I might say I'm really happy to be here because I remember the first time when I was in Token Summit in New York in 2018 when Avalanche was announced. So it was very, very interesting to see how far Avalanche has come. And of course, we'll talk today about the regulation. And I think it's, again, really, really interesting to see how far we have come with the regulations on crypto assets.
And hi everyone, it's great to be here. My name is Tommaso Astasi. I'm the head of regulatory affairs for Blockchain for Europe, which is another association based in Brussels, also a no-profit organization that aims to, first of all, educate, right? We have a lot of focus and efforts on education, both towards policymakers, but also towards the wider ecosystem and audience to really try and understand. I think the previous panel made it a very good point on this. If regulators, policymakers do not really understand what they are supposed to be regulating, then of course they may not have the same positive outcome that we hope to see. So it's great to be here. Likewise, I was also here last year at the Avalanche Summit, and it's great to be back here as a speaker now. So thanks a lot.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. So there have been two big developments, I think, in the last couple of weeks. Probably the biggest development is the European Parliament voted in favor of the MiCA regulation, which is the EU's really landmark full-scope crypto regulation covering service providers and issuers and also market abuse. And then the second big development, probably a little bit less, was the closing of His Majesty's Treasury's crypto consultation in the UK. So that's the UK's, you might call it, response to MiCA. We're a little bit further behind. I think for the purpose of this panel, we'll cover MiCA first, and then we'll cover the UK a little bit. But Tommaso, do you want to tell us a little bit about MiCA, what it's seeking to achieve, and what the time frame is for MiCA coming into force?
Sure. So let's maybe start with something that as Europeans we're really struggling with, but we like to call it MiCA, right? I'm sorry, but I have to say this. It's really, for us involved in this process for the past 3 years, hearing, the MiCA is cringing a bit. But anyway, once we got that...
It's got an R on the end.
Yeah, we got that out of the way. It's all good. Now, the timeline, the process has been really long. It's a complicated process in general. The policy-making process in Brussels is really complicated because there is 3 different institutions involved. The European Commission presenting a proposal, Parliament and Council then acting as co-legislators and trying to finalize that proposal. So this process actually started even before September 2020, which is the official publication date of the MiCA proposal. It actually started already before, when these institutions, the European Commission especially, was trying to gather some intel and trying to understand what could have been done to actually try to introduce a comprehensive regulatory framework for crypto assets. And our associations really were born in that time with that objective in mind, right? Calling for a good regulatory framework that will legitimize the crypto asset market. So fast forward now 3 years later, after hundreds of meetings with policymakers involved in negotiations, basically we actually achieved a political agreement, a final political agreement, already last year at the end of June 2022. Then everybody was already, celebrating. We got MiCA done. It's over. Well, it was almost over because we needed 9 more months then to actually finalize the nitty-gritty details of the text, which was then finally published, as you mentioned, a couple of weeks ago, officially voted and adopted by the European Parliament. There is still one more final vote happening in the Council of the EU, so the EU member states representatives. That's, I think, on the 16th of May, so a couple of weeks. And that really will be the end of this process, at least for this first part of the process. I think we're going to get to that in a moment, but just to give a very quick overview, I guess, of the timeline, we're talking now of a final date of basically publication of the proposal in the official journal of the European Union sometime in June, which really starts the clock, right? And the clock means that for 12 months, there is a transition period where the rules for stable coins will start applying only as of June 2024. And then 6 months later, that's when all the other rules for crypto assets, issuers, service provider, exchanges, platforms, all the rest of the MiCA regulation, that will also then apply as of, I would say, December 2024, January 2025, something like that. So still a bit of time ahead of us, but again, a lot of work still to be done.
Fantastic. Thank you for the overview. Marina, can you describe a little bit about what MiCA is seeking to do? What types of service providers and crypto businesses are going to be caught by the scope?
So MiCA is actually doing something very interesting, and I think it's really, really important, especially right now when we're seeing some of the outcomes coming from the US and maybe some other jurisdictions. It is a decision to basically define crypto asset as a new asset group. So it's not deciding among being a security or a financial instrument or a commodity, as we hear these discussions being held in the US, but it's really a completely new asset group. And this is what I'm saying, if you think about the beginnings of blockchain and crypto, is like we have created something completely new, even in the legal sphere, which is pretty exciting for us lawyers. So we have new rules for crypto assets. They are similar to the rules of financial, let's say, financial rules, but they are not as stringent. So the rules are basically defining what crypto assets are. Then there's a lot of rules around how to issue tokens, how to issue crypto assets. Of course, if you would want to issue to the European public. And then there are rules around crypto asset service providers. I know that many times we call them virtual asset service providers in the US and maybe some other jurisdictions, but crypto asset service providers are actually providers like exchanges and some others that are regulated in MiCA. We have very clear rules. And what is very interesting is that we had those rules before FTX happened. And I know there's been a lot of discussion, again, in maybe some other jurisdictions. How are now the new rules going to help or might help preventing FTXs in the future? We had those rules already at the time. Of course, they were not applicable to exchanges, but they have not changed after FTX. We had a lot of questions from journalists, from many other interested parties. You know, what is happening right now in the EU after FTX and, the negative news? It's basically the same. And I think that the EU institutions are really confident that those are good rules, and they're good rules to govern crypto asset service providers in the future. There's been some interesting debates around proof of work, basically elimination or limitation. Now we have found a compromise that is basically everyone that is going to issue a token or a crypto asset will need to disclose the effect it will have on environment and on climate. So there's going to be at least knowledge around how much hurtful this I would say issuance would be to the environment.
Okay, interesting. So, Teana, from the industry's perspective, do you see MiCA as a positive development in terms of certainty, etc.? Do you see any sort of negative issues arising out of MiCA that are kind of hard baked into the future now?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about MiCA, so first and foremost, I think MiCA is very positive for the industry overall. It does provide a lot of certainty and clarity around how this industry will be regulated for almost all market participants, exclusive of DeFi and NFTs, which is kind of probably next up in a MiCA 2 in a few years' time. But that certainty is helpful to builders who now know exactly what the rules are, and very importantly, you now don't have to go jurisdiction by jurisdiction across Europe getting licenses. You get one license, and then ideally you'll be able to passport across 27 member states. That's a big trading block, right? So there's a lot of economic opportunity both for Europe and for the industry, I think, that will develop. One thing that we need to keep in mind is the way that Europe legislates is very prescriptive. So, for Americans in the room, if you look at the way bills are written, they leave room for rule makers to interpret how the legislation is going to be applied. In many ways, MiCA is very, very specific about certain things. So for stablecoin issuers, for example, there are a number of things that are baked into the legislation that won't be up for debate. And some of those, I think, are going to be very technically difficult to put into practice. And so how something seems on a piece of paper and then putting it actually into effect and being able to supervise and oversee that behavior is a completely different kettle of fish than having a piece of legislation. So I think that's one thing that we'll need to stay tuned. The other thing is, in the next 8 months, people like me and Tommaso and Marina will be talking to the rulemaking bodies. So that's European Banking Authority and ESMA, who now have to take that legislation and put it into actual regulatory format. So we know exactly not just what the rules are, but how we have to do things. And there's a number of things within the legislation that are still to be developed. And so, if you have to have X amount of own capital in a deposit institution, what is that actually made of? For a stablecoin issuer, you need to have high quality liquid assets as reserves. What are those high quality liquid assets? So there's still some things that we need to determine, and the next kind of 6 to 8 months will be really important. What I think is interesting, just very quickly on the juxtaposition of kind of where we're sitting globally, Europe definitely is going to benefit from a first mover advantage, I think to a degree. And then we're going to see other jurisdictions. So coincidentally, you mentioned the UK. The crypto asset consultation just closed. But more importantly, the Financial Services and Markets Bill will likely receive royal assent in the next couple of weeks. It's the first major package for financial services regulation in the UK in the last 20 years. It will bring stablecoins squarely within the regulated perimeter. So outside of all other crypto assets, which the UK will look at, ideally, we're very likely to see stablecoins be regulated, fully regulated, by June, July of next year. So, now we have most of Europe covered for stablecoin regulation, while other jurisdictions are kind of still waiting to see how that pans out. So I think that the momentum will start to increase.
We're already seeing significant interest in Europe and in the UK regimes. I guess because that increased certainty that the market is looking for. But I think you make a really important point that this legislation is sort of the level one framework. It's the scaffolding around the crypto regime, but we're going to have this technical standards published over the next 12 months or so. What's interesting is the rules when they come in, say the stablecoin rules in 12 months' time, there's going to be a very short time window for people to comply and get their licenses, with this whole new regulatory regime. So I think when we talk about kind of niggles, I think the time frame is going to be really challenging. And I wonder if, we were looking at MiCA and taking a step back, if we were to seek to be a bit critical, do we think it's right that the European legislators have essentially taken existing financial regulation, like MiFID, the prospectus regulation, the market abuse regulation, and effectively tweaked that for crypto, but it's still financial regulation. It's not, a new bespoke regime for crypto. What do you think, Tommaso?
I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have when facing these upcoming regulations in Europe like elsewhere, right? Because policymakers in the end, they tend to adopt what they know, right? They tend to rely on the regulation and the policy frameworks that have developed and used and deployed for years, and so then they see at something that somehow resembles financial activities, financial risks, and the easier choice, the easier route in that sense is to really just say, well, let's just adapt those frameworks. So in that sense, the European Union, as you point out, did something similar on some aspects. Some other aspects, as Marina was saying, is they actually took this approach of, well, these are not financial instruments, so let's start thinking at how do we classify these new types, these new categories of assets, and create this new definition of asset reference tokens, e-money tokens, which are different from e-money that used to exist before, and all the other crypto assets, which is this major bucket that basically captures more or less everything else. So in that sense, there is that risk, and I think the more conversations we have with regulators and policymakers around the world, we continue to see that risk being very present, because it's just the easiest way. But at the same time, I personally, for example, I wouldn't blame politicians that are maybe older generation that are looking at these new innovative technologies, not really understanding clearly how these things work. And then again, I go back to my initial point. Our main objective, our main challenge, our main focus is education, right? Because if we don't get to that same level of understanding, if we don't have policymakers that really understand the difference between this financial services regulation that we had so far and what needs to be a bit more of a bespoke regime for crypto assets, then we may actually have some issues and problems.
Makes sense. And Marina, do you have any insight into the exemptions in the regime? Because I'm interested that in the financial services regime, there's this whole host of exemptions. So if you're dealing on your own capital, for example, you don't need to get a license. But in MiCA, all of those exemptions have been removed, apart from the group exemption, which says if you're performing services just for your group company, then you don't need to get a license. Why is MiCA broader in scope than typical financial services regulation?
That's very interesting. I think it might be that it was easier to draft it this way. I think it's, if you think about it, it's still very nascent. It's so early. We don't know exactly how those services will evolve in the future, and maybe how they will really look like. And I would say that might be the easy way how to draft it. But at the same time, I might go back to what was said previously on ESMA and EBA's work. I think many times, I know that there is a lot of builders here in the room, and of course at the conference, it's like they come up with questions like, NFTs are excluded. So is this, the service that I'm having, or is the NFT that I'm issuing, is this really excluded from MiCA, or is it included in MiCA? We don't have a very, very clear understanding where the line is between an NFT being non-fungible and between an NFT maybe going into the fungibility direction. So these are really the rules and the guidance that we're going to get from ESMA, and I think that on the services might be the same. Maybe I'll just mention also the crowdfunding regulation that I think at least somehow was inspired by at least the issuance part of MiCA. And just the last comment, what Tommaso said before, I would agree. We know that in the future, the national competent authorities are going to have a lot of power. So whenever you're going to, if you want to have a license or talk to someone, you're going to talk to a national competent authorities, choose one in one jurisdiction, and except from So bigger companies and specific like stablecoins, etc., they were going to talk directly to ESMA, but the national competent authorities are going to be the important one, and there are a lot of them, and they might
Choose
not
wisely.
have. Sorry?
Choose wisely.
Exactly. They might not all have the same knowledge. They're not using all the same language. They all have different languages, and they also might not have enough capacity. So some of them are already having a lot of applications, and what we learn is that they understand a lot. Just by getting those applications, getting all those business models being described in such a detailed way, asking back questions, they have so much information, and they will learn about our, I would say, our ecosystem in a very, very short amount of time.
So watch this space for regulatory intervention. We hear politicians talk a lot about, the effect of this legislation. So some of the European officials have said that FTX couldn't have happened under the MiCA regime in Europe. And then in the UK, you've had the Prime Minister come out and say that we're going to create a world-leading crypto ecosystem in the UK. Teana, can you talk to us a little bit? You've already mentioned the stablecoin regime, but can you talk to us a little bit more broadly about what's happening in the UK and what we're expecting from the government?
Sure. So just very quickly to wrap up on the MiCA side, I think the one thing that I would advise everybody in the room, again, if you're looking at getting licensing, definitely kind of shop around and make sure that you're comfortable with the national competent authority that you're going to be engaging with. And secondly, we focused a lot on MiCA. MiCA is part of a broad package that a lot of people forget about. So we're going to have a new money laundering authority in Europe. We've just going through the Digital Markets Act, which is going to dramatically look at how data is shared. We have a transfer funds regulation that is implemented at the same time that MiCA will be. So coming into Europe is going to be, and when we talk about kind of a very clear understanding of what obligations will be, there's a number of things that are changing, so keep that in mind. And I mention that because the UK, as everybody knows, Brexited from Europe about 6 years ago, and the purpose of the Financial Services Markets Act is to basically unbundle regulatory obligation that existed within the European Union and bring that into scope into the UK and have it be sufficiently different in some areas and create opportunities. And one of those opportunities that's been identified by the current government is the intention to become a crypto asset hub. And so what does that mean? Anybody that's been working in the UK over the last couple of years has known that it has been slow moving, and that our regulator has been one of those that has been kind of learning on the job, and certainly has a bigger team, has more experience and expertise than it previously had. And the government is really pushing to leverage the UK's legacy of being a fintech capital of the world, with good, solid financial regulation. So I think in some ways there are things that we can leverage from existing frameworks. In the case of stablecoins, for example, they look like e-money, they walk like e-money, so they're probably e-money. And so then can you bring them into an e-money regime, which everybody understands how that works? And if stablecoins are going to be shifting into the utility phase and being used for payments, and that's where we see enormous growth happening today, then that makes an awful lot of sense. Now, going back to the difference in the types of use cases, does that change the regulatory treatment for stablecoins based on how you use it? That's a question we're unclear about today. So I do think that the second half of MiCA that comes into force in the latter part of next year, comparing that to the crypto asset consultation that just closed, you're seeing similar questions being asked. And additionally, if you look at kind of the juxtaposition with the US, market conduct is probably the next big thing that the UK will focus on outside of stablecoins. So I do think that the government is very committed to this. I am on the board of Crypto UK, which is the UK's trade body. which is a secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group in Parliament for crypto and digital assets. And this ABPG is very, very active. If anybody knows anything about, it's basically like a caucus in Congress. But this ABPG has conducted its own inquiry alongside the Treasury Select Committee. The results of that will be coming out soon. They meet regularly with the FCA and with Treasury, and they're very actively involved, which is not something we've seen, I would say, prior to maybe 18 months ago.
Fantastic. We are out of time, so I think we're going to wrap up now. We did leave a chair open for Gary Gensler, but he didn't show, unfortunately, so sorry about that. Maybe if we have 1 minute, does anyone have any questions? Maybe we have time for one question, and then we'll wrap up. They explained it so perfectly. There are no questions. So if you could maybe give our panelists a round of applause.
Thank you.